Good morning, everybody. Happy Hanukkah. Welcome to our latest edition of Rip from the Headlines. This week we're going to tackle a subject that I have been noting the last couple of months in the news. As we all know, in Israel, there is plenty of history. Anywhere you go, you remove a little bit of earth, and there you have a whole archaeological dig. And there have been a number of headlines coming out of Israel last couple of months about different finds. Originally, when I started thinking about this, I think it was about 6 weeks ago, there was a headline, 2,700-year-old toilet uncovered. And they had uncovered what had seemed to be kind of a restroom that was utilized in a small village. And even then, I was wondering, what does archaeology, are these types of archaeological finds, what light does that shed on our Judaism? What happens if we uncover certain things that were different than as described in Jewish sources? Or what happens if we find things confirmed? We talked a little bit about this a few months ago when we talked about Jews not following Jewish tradition. They had uncovered animal bones from Jewish settlements, and it seemed as if that there were non-kosher animal bones there. So it looks like the Jews were eating non-kosher, and we had a conversation about that. But more specifically, what do we learn from archaeology? And what might that tell us about Jewish experience, and what might that tell us about Jewish practice, both the Jewish practice then, as well as what we might learn about our own practice today. And in particular, relating to Hanukkah, there was just a find in the last couple of weeks. It's the headline on the source sheet from the Jerusalem Post. On November 16th, Seleucid fortress destroyed by Hasmonean army revealed ahead of Hanukkah. Perfect. Now we know that Hanukkah happened. So what's the story? Some 2,100 years ago, the Hasmonean army was marching toward the Hellenistic city of Maresha in Israel's Shfela region, also known as the Judean foothills. Leading them was John Hyrcanus, a high priest and the ruler of Judea, a nephew of the Hanukkah hero Judah Maccabee, decades earlier had led the victorious revolt against the Seleucids in the region. The Judean army was first spotted by Seleucid soldiers stationed in a fortress on a hill overlooking the city. Some 2 millennia later, the structure was uncovered in archaeological excavation, a unique testimony to the conflict that raged through the land of Israel in the 2nd century BCE, just ahead of Hanukkah. The antiquity authorities announced on Tuesday. Our theory is that the Seleucids blocked the entrance of the fortress and fled to the city as their enemies approached, said archaeologist Achinoam Montague, excavation director on behalf of the IAA, together with Sa'ar Ganor, Vlad Lifshitz. As the Hasmoneans reached the structure, they set it on fire. Among the artifacts were also a few well-preserved small jugs, often used to store expensive liquids, and possibly not so different from that little jug that, according to the Jewish tradition, was instrumental for the Hanukkah miracle, which a small jug that contained pure olive oil kept on refilling itself to allow the menorah in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem to be lit for 8 days. Now, that comment about that small amount of oil lasting for 8 days, in the article mentioning that it was that it refilled itself, is part of the age-old Hanukkah discussion as to the how long was the miracle? Because as Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Beit Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch, raised that question, if there was enough oil to last for 1 day, but instead it lasts for 8 days, then how long was the miracle of Hanukkah? 7 days. It wasn't an 8-day miracle, it was a 7-day miracle because they had enough oil for 1 day. So there are dozens of answers or variations of answers that have been suggested. There's a whole book that has 500 answers listed. I figure I'll read them all right now. No, just kidding. But a couple of the answers, one answer is that they found enough oil for 1 day, and they knew it was going to take 8 days for it to get new oil for either travel purposes or purity purposes, and they put in 1/8 of a cup, and that 1/8 of a cup lasted the full day. So even day one, was a miracle. Another explanation that's given is that the cups kept refilling themselves miraculously. So they put in the whole amounts in the 7 candles of the menorah, but at the end of the day, the oil had miraculously not gone down. And that's what this article is referencing, one of those answers. So that's what the oil kept refilling itself. That's one way of describing a miracle to last for all 8 days, because otherwise you only have a 7-day miracle. The stories of the Maccabees, getting back to the article, are coming to life before our eyes. And this is the most fascinating part of the Israel Antiquities Authority's work, when dedicated, hardworking archaeologists breathe life into the historical annals of the people who passed through this land, said IAA General Director Eli Escozido. In a few days, we'll be celebrating Hanukkah, whose central theme is the Hasmoneans defeated the Hellenists, leading the establishment of the first independent sovereign Jewish entity. The Hasmoneans could have no idea 2,000 years later, students living in the state of Israel would be following in their footsteps. It is extremely exciting. So here we have an archaeological find connecting to the holiday which we are celebrating. And as Eli Esposito says, it's very exciting to see history come alive at the same time where we are generally just remembering the history. And there's been a number of other articles about it. That how do they know that they set the place on fire? So one of the facts that they found is that there are no human remains inside the fortress, which seems to indicate that there was no battle that took place, because if there had been battle, the likelihood there would be some bodies that were strewn about, and therefore some human remains would be found, but they found none of that. And some of us heard from the professor of archaeology at Bar Ilan University, who would have a lot more to say about this and other such finds. So here we have a very nice present, all wrapped up for us for Hanukkah, where some indication of the Hanukkah story is coming to light. Now, there have been plenty of excavations. Recently, in the last couple of days, there was an article about finding what may have been the meeting place of the Sanhedrin in Yavne, which is one of the places Sanhedrin moved after the destruction of the Second Temple. So it is not uncommon to find remnants and evidence of all that we experience. Anyone who's visited the city of David knows they're finding things going back to the period of David and even beforehand. So that it shouldn't surprise us that it's there. The question is here, it's just surprising or just exciting that it's right around the Hanukkah time. But what are the reactions that we have to evidence or lack thereof with regard to our Torah stories, with regard to the biblical narrative, with regard to how we commemorate and celebrate? Right, Judaism, we're based upon revelation, we're based upon faith. Right, it doesn't really matter whether we find evidence or not, but it's always nice to have a little bit of evidence. It'd be nice to, it's always nice to attach images to stories. That's why the movie The Ten Commandments is so powerful. You kind of imagine that's what it might have been like. But what happens if you don't have that proof? And especially we've been reading the story in the Parshios of our patriarchs. Right, we don't really have proof of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. There are archaeological finds from that time period. Same thing with regards to Yosef in Egypt. Right? We're going to start reading about Yosef's rise in Egypt this week. How does that, if he was really viceroy, where's the proof? What about the Jews living in Egypt, right? Even trying to identify the Pharaoh. So, this is a question that's in the background, right? As the common expression goes, for the believer, there are no questions. For the skeptic, there are no answers. But, so we believe, but what about that question of whether or not there's archaeological evidence here? So it's already, I couldn't believe it was 20 years ago that there was a big brouhaha over Rabbi David Wolpe's Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, who spoke about the archaeological evidence, the lack of archaeological evidence with regard to the Exodus. And the source number one, Jewish Telegraphic Agency report from that period, 2001. Furor over LA rabbis' reading of Exodus. Passover has passed. The Los Angeles Jews are still heatedly discussing whether the Exodus actually happened. Controversy labeled a hurricane by the Jewish Journal of Greater Los Angeles was triggered by Rabbi David Wolpe, spiritual leader of conservative congregation Sinai Temple, author of numerous popular books on Judaism. In 3 sermons at the beginning and end of Passover, Wolpe examined current research in biblical archaeology and concluded that virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agrees that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all. Right, and Wolpe goes on to say that it's not that he's saying it didn't happen. He's saying archaeologist says it didn't happen. Article continues. It's a well-known fact that millions of Jews have doubts about the literal veracity of Bible stories. My sermons emphasize that faith is independent of doubt. I wanted the millions of doubting Jews to know that they can still be faithful Jews, Wolpe said in a statement. If scholarly books are written that question the literal veracity of Bible stories, it does not help our credibility to pretend that they don't exist. By discussing these books, we maintain the Jewish tradition of sustaining faith by seeking truth. He continued, ignoring the books, on the other hand, conveys a message of fear. We are afraid that science will shake our faith. I don't believe it should, and that's why I spoke out. So it was a pretty big brouhaha. People were saying, oh, the rabbi said the Exodus didn't happen. But, Wolpe raises the issue that, similar to, as we said, believing Jews, it doesn't really matter whether you find the evidence or not, but what about the science that's out there? Are we even interested in what we might find out there with regards to how to understand or dig more deeply into the story that we tell as Jews, or even the practices that we have as Jews? And we could say the short answer is no, because we're not really a people that is dependent on archaeological evidence. We are the Am HaSefer, the people of the book, and which is really about the people of the tradition, right? The book was only what only emerged out of necessity. And for example, we have always been the people passing down the tradition, the stories that we tell from one generation to the next. Right, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, some 1,800 years ago, realized that telling the story is not enough. So the rules are not enough. So he wrote down the rules, and then that prompted more of a discussion, which led to the Gemara, and subsequent generations have led to added layers of written information to tell us what to do. But should we be curious? And does curiosity kill the cat? Does it lead to problems? And that's what we're going to take a look at. A couple of sources, a couple of precedents where this does seem to be something that interested the rabbis. And the question is, what happens with what they find? But before we go in that direction, any reactions, comments, questions before we go further? Feel free to unmute or type it into the chat.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I was absolutely thrilled to see the post about the time of the creation, how the Israelis anticipated the event and so forth. But I did not know that England voted against the resolution. And I was reminded when we were in Jerusalem, seeing a longer film about that time. If anything could make a person proud and brought to tears the events of that day.
Right. So thanks. Al's referring to the fact that yesterday was November 29th, which was the day that the UN voted on the resolution to partition Palestine, including a Jewish state. Look, history is definitely something that we pay attention to and should be inspired by. Sometimes, more, some events more than others. In our case, we're going to look at a couple of situations in a couple of halachot, and we can immediately think of that there are situations where we've uncovered great repositories of historical evidence. What comes to mind, many have heard of the Cairo Geniza, right? The shul in Cairo, they found the Geniza is what we do with worn out books or holy objects. Some people call it Shemos. They call it Shemos because it has holy names on it, God's names, Shemot. And what you have to do with them is you have to put them in Geniza. You have to put them away. You have to bury them. You're not allowed to just dispose of them. And they have found in Cairo, Geniza, documents going back some 15, 1600 years until contemporary times. What do the documents look like? What are the books look like? What do the Torah scrolls look like? Or, for example, the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? What kind of texts were they using? Some of their texts are similar, some of them are not similar. Was the deviation on their part or on our part? So these are relatives of the issue that we're debating. But we were going to look at a source from the Talmud and Bava Batra, where it seems as if this was something that the rabbis were interested in as well, the historical evidence. So there was a story there's a whole series of stories about Rabba bar Bar Chana. And he was once traveling with an Arab guide, and the Arab guide said to Rabba bar Bar Chana, "Come, I will show you the dead of the wilderness. The Jewish people who left Egypt had died in the wilderness. I went and saw them, and they had the appearance of one who was intoxicated, and they're lying on their backs." So it's a bit of a wondrous tale where the Arab guide is going to be able to show Rabba bar Bar Chana where the Jews who died in the desert, the 40 years in the desert, where the whole generation that left Egypt died out, where they were buried. And he saw them, and they looked as if they were lying on their backs. And the knee of one of them was elevated, and he was so enormous that the Arab entered under his knee while riding a camel with his spear upright, and he did not touch it. Right, so they were these gigantic bodies. You have to sort of kind of picture. You have the bent knee, and they're able to travel underneath it with a spear upright and not even banging into it. Again, it's a story, which we don't know exactly all the details, whether accurate, whether it's it's like that guy's as tall as a mountain. Right? Doesn't mean he's really as tall as a mountain. It just means he's large. But that's in general how we have to sometimes approach the legends of the Talmud, the Agadah. So anyway, the Arab is there, and Rabba bar Bar Chana says, "I cut one corner of the sky blue garment that contains ritual fringes of one of them." Right, so he cut off a piece of the tzitzis, and we were unable to walk. Somehow they were immobilized by by Rabba bar Bar Chana's attempt to take something away. Like if you need some sort of a visualization of this, like in the Indiana Jones movies, when he wants to take something, he has to put something else there back immediately. Otherwise, all of the booby traps will go off. Or when they're taking the thing out of the cave, everything falls apart. Right? This was not supposed to be taken away, so they're immobilized. The Arab said to me, "Perhaps you took something from them. Right? Maybe we can't go because you took something. Return, as we know by tradition, that one who takes something from them cannot walk." I then returned the corner of the garment, and then we're able to walk. Right, so you're not allowed to steal any of these archaeological artifacts. So Rabba bar Bar Chana returns home. "When I came before the sages, they said to me in rebuke, 'Every Abba is a donkey, every bar Chana is an idiot.'" Right? They were angry with him. "They're you fool. For the purpose of clarifying what halacha did you do that? Why do you take this away? Were you trying to figure out a law? If you wanted to know whether the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai or in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel as to whether there are 3 or 4 threads and joints and ritual fringes, in that case, there was no need to take anything with you. You should have just counted the threads and counted the joints. All right, why do you have to take anything? You should have just looked at what you found, and you could report back that way, and then we would be able to determine whether these Jews in the desert who died in the desert were wearing their tzitzis tied like Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel." And leaving aside the specific nature of that machlokas, here we seem to see, it seems that this story is about that Rabba bar Bar Chana encountered some archaeological find that was very compelling, and he felt would be able to be helpful in understanding or being more specific in answering the question of Jewish practice. And so what did he do? He wanted to take back some evidence. And the rabbis are not really that pleased with what he was doing. They say, "You didn't have to take back evidence. You could have just told us what you found." There are those who look at this response of the rabbis by calling him foolish by wanting to do this as evidence that basically, that this was not meant to be a halachic investigation. This may have been an archaeological find, but it's nothing halachic about what he saw. So in fact, Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, who is really one of the leading sages, elderly leading sages of the Haredi community in Bnei Brak, he wrote, and this is a translation of a comment he made about the subject. He's writing this comment in Parsha Shlach. Parsha Shlach is the story of the spies, and that's the origin story of the dying in the desert. So Rabbi Kanievsky writes, the fact that Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, source 3, was prevented from heaven from taking the corner to clarify the law, as well as the fact that heaven confounded him so he couldn't even count the strings. Rabbi Kanievsky says that it's not just that he couldn't take the thing; he didn't count the strings. He could easily have done so, but that he was confounded from heaven. Clearly teaches that God does not want the halacha to be clarified in such a manner by uncovering ancient objects and the like. The only way to know the law is through studying Torah to arrive at the conclusion. So Rabbi Kanievsky reads this as a situation of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana was trying to use the archaeological evidence to gauge or guide an understanding of the halachic decision, and that's unacceptable. And again, this is obviously an agadah, it's a story. This isn't the Talmud saying don't use archaeological evidence, but from the experience of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, Rabbi Kanievsky sees from here a situation where we're not supposed to be very interested in what we see in the past, because it doesn't matter. Halacha is the halacha, regardless of what you see. So that is one example. Another example, it seems that it seems like these ritual objects are where we encounter this. The first case was about tzitzis. The next one is about tefillin. So when it comes to tefillin, we all know what tefillin are, what they look like. What's inside the tefillin are 4 passages from the Torah. The first and second paragraphs of Shema, and then 2 paragraphs from early in the book of Exodus that mention tefillin. It's at the end of Parshat Bo. And so in the hand tefillin, it's all written on one scroll, rolled up and put inside the hand tefillin. On the head tefillin, the shel rosh, each of them is inserted into 4 compartments that are part of the tefillin shel rosh. And so there is a machlokes as to what is the order of those portions and how they are inserted into the tefillin. And this is famously summarized as a machlokes between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. You may have noticed that people have the word Rashi on their tefillin bag. You may notice that some people most often, or in particular Hasidic Jews, sometimes have 2 pairs of tefillin. And the idea is, well, there's the machlokes between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. We want to make sure that we fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin, so let's put on both of them. Now, the commonly accepted practice is Rashi, and everyone makes a bracha on Rashi tefillin. And if you put on additional pairs to make sure you fulfill the blessing, you then don't make a bracha. But that is the machlokes Rashi Rabbeinu Tam. At some point, you have to wonder which one is right. Can they both be right? Now, that is, of course, the Jewish joke about the 2 Jews who have an argument come to the rabbi, and the first one presents his case, and the rabbi says, "You're right." And the second one is upset and says, "But Rabbi," presents his case. The rabbi says, "You're right." And then, of course, the rabbi's wife is there and says, "How can they both be right? You're right, too." And that's exactly how we have to apply to tefillin, because it has been noted that there's probably 7, 8, 9, 10 opinions about how exactly the tefillin should be put together in the order of the parshiot. But the halachic process, the more accepted opinions rise to the top. The other ones are viewed. People will say, "Well, how can there be machlokes? Don't we know one way or another?" And that's a whole separate dispute, a whole separate conversation as to certain aspects of the tradition may not have been so set in stone that there can be any deviation, similar to the way we have different practices between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. But for here, what about the tefillin? How should it be done? So the Sefer Mitzvot Gedolos, the Smag, is a collection of the 613 commandments, and he talks about how it's in Hebrew. Translate the practice has been to follow the opinion of the practice Makom Nahagu Be'eretz Yishmael Kedivrei Rabbeinu Shlomo Kedivrei Rabbeinu Moshe. Right? We follow Rabbeinu Shlomo's Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, and he says V'gam Sholchu Ktav Me'eretz Yisrael. that we got a message, a letter from Israel, Shenafla Bimash al Kever Yecheskel, that there is what is ascribed to be the gravesite of the prophet Yecheskel, and something fell. Umatzu sham tefillin yeshenim ma'od kisidran Rabbeinu Moshe v'Rashi. They found a pair of tefillin there, and they were Rashi-style tefillin. So the ancient tefillin were Rashi-style tefillin, and maybe this should be the exclamation point on following Rashi. And here we're utilizing archaeological evidence. So some then pointed out, well, that could be, or maybe not, right? I said that, so the Drisha source number 5 says that he heard, Ainli source say to Rabbeinu Tam Ashramot Tzum Bekev Chesed Divrei Rashi. Shadrav Rabbeinu Tam Matzi Lemeim Shapsulin Hayu Shaksavim Biosan Asel Kach Nikbru Bekivro Kedin Svarm Sun Shnikbru V'Nitmim Bekivro Shel Tzaddik. No, why did you find the Rashi tefillin buried in the grave? Because they were puzzled. We have a practice of taking holy objects and burying them in the graves of the righteous. So you found Rashi tefillin in the grave of Yecheskel because people had disposed of them because they were not appropriate to be worn. So really, they were we should follow Rabbeinu Tam because people were burying and disposing of Rashi. So, ultimately, we seem to find, the first case was a story, a legend of the Talmud, and of the potential of should we use the archaeological evidence, and we see Rabbi Kanievsky pushing back. It's a story. Here we have a halachic discussion taking place, but also the introduction of the fact that there's a big doubt here, right? Just because you find something doesn't necessarily mean that what you find tells the story that you think, right? That's the issue with archaeologists in general, right? On the one hand, you have the evidence that you find, but then you're trying to put it into context, and how you do so is a narrative. And there's one narrative of finding Rashi tefillin by Yecheskel is that we wear Rashi tefillin. Another way of looking at the narrative is no, we're supposed to wear Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin because Rashi tefillin were disposed, and we see the complexity there. A third example, and it has to do with we talked about the shekel coins. And we know that the Jews were counted by each contributing a half shekel. So the shekel coin has some relevance if we're trying to figure out how the coins that we use for the Pidyon Haben, redeeming the firstborn, how much silver they need to contain, how big are they, and the like. So when the Torah introduces the half shekel, there's a discussion of how big was the half shekel. So source number 6, the Ramban quotes Rashi, who says, a shekel weighs 4 gold coins, making half an ounce according to the correct weight of cologne, right? Rashi was familiar with the German currency system. So that's how big the shekel was, half an ounce according to Rashi. But as to Rashi's estimation that in terms of the gold coins found in his generation, our generation, the shekel is equivalent to half an ounce, as you mentioned, that is not so. For the kings of the peoples have lessened the weight of the gold coins. Right? That may be true in Rashi's time, but it's not true in our time. And so therefore, Ramban talks about Rashi's measurement and says that may have been true then, but it's not necessarily true now. And there's the shekel is a different amount, and he follows a different opinion. And it's actually the opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif. So then in the Ramban, there's here's an interesting offshoot of archaeology is what about manuscripts, right? We have the volumes, we buy the books, but where do they get the books from? They get the books from manuscripts that have been collected over time. So when it comes to the Ramban's commentary, we usually have the standard manuscript, but other notes of the Ramban have been found, and they've been published. So in one of those manuscripts, there's an addendum to this, right? So Ramban quotes Rashi and says he disagrees with Rashi, because Rashi's calculation is no longer relevant. But the Ramban says, God has blessed me that I have merited to arrive in Akko, and I found the elders possess an engraved silver coin. We know at the end of his life, Ramban, Nachmanides traveled to Israel. He's in Akko, and they have a coin. And there was writing on the coin. It's engraved. The writing was shown to the local Kutim. The Kutim are the Samaritans who had lived in Israel throughout, who were immediately able to read the writing since it was Ivri script that the Kutim used, as mentioned in Talmud Sanhedrin. right? If you ever seen some of these archaeological finds that say to have a Hebrew inscription, you're like, what is that? That doesn't look like Hebrew, because the script that was used in these times, in ancient times, was different than the script used today. And Ivri script, even though it sounds like it's Hebrew, is a different type of script that the Samaritans read. And one side read Shekel HaShekalim, and the second side read Yerushalayim HaKadosha. So there's this ancient shekel coin that said shekel of shekels, which is kind of saying this is the real deal. We weighed the coin, and its weight matched Rashi's opinion, and this provided Rashi's view tremendous support. So here we have the Ramban quoting Rashi, saying Rashi is incorrect. And then later on, because of something that was found, saying Rashi is correct. And so it's an area of interpretation of Jewish measurement, which isn't necessarily relevant in day-to-day life, but we see the utilizing historical evidence to come up with what is the opinion. Now, is this authoritative or definitive? Not necessarily. Abarbanel, right? Isaac Abarbanel from Spain was familiar with this opinion of the Ramban, and he writes that he also krashem lefanai shekel hakodesh echad. I had a shekel, and he weighed it, and it was the half an chatzi okia, half an ounce, right? But im lo shebeorach hazman nisdaldel mimenu davar muat kiken yaseh b'chol matbea. He says the coin could have gotten rubbed off. He said the coin could have, right? It could have gotten worn down over time, and that could technically impact its weight. Does it? Doesn't it? Well, when they find these coins, they find this archaeological evidence. Is it pristine? Has it been impacted? These are all variables. So, if we first had a story where in the Talmud, where they're trying to look at historical evidence, Rabbi Kanievsky bats it away. We have the story of tefillin, where the Smog seems to accept it, but you can't be so sure, because this could be some of, Rabbi Kanievsky can reject it out of hand, but what are some of the reasons that that may lead to rejecting archaeological evidence? Well, first, the evidence, the objects, the artifacts can tell multiple stories. Like finding the tefillin, does it tell us that Rashi's right or Rabbeinu Tam's right? Find the coin. Ramban had a whole theory of Rashi being wrong and found the coin, and Rashi was right. But maybe he found the coin that Rashi was right, but maybe that coin isn't as pristine evidence, because who knows what happened to the coin. So when as more and more archaeological digs were taking place in Israel, and that's where we would expect to encounter an impact on long-held Jewish traditions and beliefs. This came to be discussed by the various leading rabbis of the day. So for example, the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Aaron Mishaya Karelitz, who was the uncle of Rabbi Kanievsky, he wrote in a letter, "I'm not acquainted with the endeavor of excavation and study of antiquities, and I oppose this enterprise because of the many uncertainties involved." Well, we've seen what some of those uncertainties are. He was also very much against utilizing manuscripts, the new manuscripts that were found, even though we have the Rambam, Maimonides himself, mentioning utilizing different manuscripts. And sometimes the manuscripts uncovering, clarifying certain laws. Even Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook, right, the famous Rabbi Kook, source number 9, regarding the issue of establishing the reading of the Megillah in a certain locale on the 15th of Adar. So we know that Purim is the 14th of Adar, except in walled cities, going back to the times of Joshua, where Jews were living during Purim time, and when the rabbis were establishing Purim, they read it on the 15th. So very famously, Yerushalayim. Hebron, a couple of others, but mostly it's Yerushalayim. But what about some of these other ancient cities in Israel? And so there have been some tradition. The Talmud mentions a couple of these cities, including Lud, including Akko. And the question is, where these cities are located today, are they located the same location as the cities that the Talmud is mentioning? So Rav Kook writes, "I do not find that the evidence you have sent me is sufficient to establish these places as having been surrounded by walls during the period of Joshua. The evidence does not even rise to the level of doubt, since it must overcome the Rambam's observation that the majority of cities of the world were not surrounded by walls during the time of Joshua. The entire enterprise of Eretz Yisrael scholarship is filled with guesswork. Although this endeavor is worthy of respect and warm admiration for the scholars involved in this study due to our love of Holy Torah matters, nonetheless, one cannot make halachic decisions based on the Arab names of a specific area. Nevertheless, if you have any fundamentally different proofs or sources, kindly inform me of them, and Bli Neder, I will express my views on this matter. So Rav Kook also is hesitant to accept the evidence. He is more kindly disposed towards the endeavor, right? The Chazon Ish was not so positive about this. We see, Rav Kanievsky, his nephew, or echoes or amplifies that dissatisfaction and that opposition. Rav Kook not willing to accept, but kindly disposed as he was. So a lot of the efforts taking place in Israel, even if it wasn't in line with moving forward the religious understanding of things, that was the Rav Kook approach. But it becomes complicated. There are other discussions that so one of the ways that this might help us understand in particular, I believe it was the city of Lod, but it may have been Akko. I don't remember right now. But they found graveyards. They found remains, and maybe the remains would be able to tell us something. And Rabbi Yitzhak Weiss, a well-known rabbinic authority from England, who then moved to Israel, and the head of the Eda HaCharedit, the ultra-Orthodox Bezdin, felt that finding those human remains dating back to that period was enough to at least determine that city should read the Megillah on the 14th and the 15th, because therefore, we have at least it rises to the level of doubt, as opposed to Rav Kook, who didn't see the evidence presented to him as creating a doubtful situation. Rabbi Weiss said that between the evidence that we already have plus this additional evidence, then the Purim is on the 14th, but they should read the Megillah on the 15th without a bracha, just to cover all of the bases. And so you have, you certainly have this archaeological finds as presenting opportunities to try and clarify and explore more deeply what the truth is. Getting to the truth is difficult just by the nature of what is being found, because it doesn't really give us explicit instructions. It tells a story, and that story can have different twists and turns. It isn't always necessarily 100% clear. Want to mention one other example of this that's more contemporary, but first, any questions or comments?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I believe, and you may not, and everybody else may not, there are philosophically truths and higher truths. For me, the higher truth is that Judaism is important and has preserved and prevailed, and following Judaism and keeping it going, for me, is the highest truth, the most important truth. A lower truth is where there is debate between science and halachic beliefs. I don't believe those discussions are important. Maybe I'm being too cynical or not, but for me, the higher truth is forget that dispute and that vein of discussion completely. It's a waste of time and counterproductive.
Well, I think that we're all talking about that there is this higher truth that has kept, that is important, that keeps Judaism moving, and that's part of our continuity. We can call that Masorah, tradition. The question is, what happens when we have different conversations? We maybe call it background noise or other sources of information that may conflict or create a controversy, or at least create a little bit of friction with that Masorah. Do you go straight forward and ignore and not be distracted by any of these things on this side? Or do you take the time to try and respond? I think that would, that's, David Wolpe was trying to full stop, bring it on, let the other side have their say. Let's entertain that possibility, because at the end, if we are committed to our tradition, then it doesn't matter. We won't be impacted by this background noise. At the same time, sometimes once you stop and listen to the background noise, you get completely distracted from the main event, and that leads to too many questions. And I think that, for example, the Chazon Ish's opposition to using historical evidence, archaeological finds, and the like, comes from a mindset that we can't stop and be distracted by these historical by this historical evidence, or by these details that we find, because you know what, we don't know what the story is going to tell us, so let's just go right through it. Others would say, well, no, we have to, this is all part of Torah, let's fully explore it. I think that there's something similar with regards to some of the other issues where modernity has created some complexity out of other situations. Like we've talked before about the age of the universe, right? Age of the universe. So we have a Torah timeline, which is 5782, and we have science, which is 14 billion. Do we entertain the possibility of that being anything other than 5782? Well, I would think most people would say yes. However, some rabbis have said we can't do that anymore. We don't have time to stop and analyze a situation. So I think that there are those who see the Rabbi Bar Chana story as an anomaly, or as Rabbi Kanievsky did, understand it as evidence that we're not supposed to slow down when we encounter the history or the archaeology or the science. And you have others who are willing to slow down, whether it be with regards to the tefillin or with regards to the size of the shekel, but it really depends on how much tolerance or how much bandwidth we have to entertain this. And if we're going to have a broader bandwidth, we have to be willing to recognize it could be a slippery slope. As we often say, you need the sturdy shoes to respond. One of the questions which doesn't necessarily have as much of a downside, and it's a contemporary one, is the one that raised in the last source. Just a couple of lines from the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Chil Michal Epstein, turn of the 20th century, and he's describing source number 10, tzitzis, with regard to tcheles, the blue string that goes on the tzitzis. We read every morning in the Shema that one of the strings had blue, right? That was even where we started with Rabbi Bar Chana, trying to look at the strings and the ties and everything. So what about the blue string? So for many generations, it doesn't seem to have been exist. We didn't have the blue string. Different efforts over time had been introduced. Very famously in the 1800s, the Radzina Rebbe introduced tcheles. More recently, there had been at the turn of the 20th century, Rabbi Herzog and others started to try and identify a snail as being the source of this, which by the time you get to the 1980s, seems to have caught on and been more definitively identified as the source of the tcheles. And now you can buy tcheles. There's a whole organization, how many strings, all of these conversations are once again relevant. So the Aruch HaShulchan in the Laws of Tzitzis was describing this and says, due to our sins, we've been spread out and we don't have tcheles. And he writes, Ein anu yodin mizeh klal, v'chol tzitzis shelanu lavan. We don't know about this at all, and all of our strings are white. Mikol makom, nevertheless, we can still fulfill the mitzvah because we have already established in Jewish tradition, tcheles eino ma'akev es halavan. You don't have blue string, you can still fulfill the mitzvah with white, right? And therefore, you can't ignore tzitzis. If you ignore tzitzis, you are responsible. Ansho meruba, great punishment. Vida. And you should know, shazeh shanim sfuros, a number of years, sha'achar sha'echad hispaer shematzah hachilazon v'yasa lanu tcheles. Someone came with a claim that they had found the chilazon, which is the source of the blue dye. V'himshich acharav eza anashim, various individuals followed him. Ach lo hayalo shomea migdolei hador u'miklal Yisrael. There were no great sages who agreed, nor did it become widespread. And therefore, this is set aside until Mashiach comes speedily in our days. And that's the 20th century, turn of the 20th century. Fast forward, there are many who would say that tcheles, science has helped us uncover the sources, and it should be a mitzvah to wear tcheles. Now, no one who encourages tcheles will say that if you don't wear tcheles, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. But this seems to be kind of an example of some form of low-hanging fruit, where the archaeological and scientific evidence has given us some level of confidence in being able to say that this is the mitzvah. There are many who would say, and this is something that Rabbi Herschel Schachter quotes Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik as saying, that his great-grandfather didn't wear tcheles, so why should he wear tcheles? Right? We have a tradition, and why should we deviate unless you have overwhelming evidence that you have to go in that direction? And we don't have that. We have some indications. We have some finds. We don't have anything that's definitive in telling us we have to wear tcheles. So if it was good enough for them, it's good enough for us. But look, sometimes that doesn't always win the argument. On other areas of Jewish law, we've become more particular than in previous generations. But we have here an example where the Aruch HaShulchan rejects some of the efforts to present an innovation or restoration of a Jewish practice by saying, look, it hasn't been accepted by the leading sages, and he makes an important point that the people haven't accepted it. Tcheles to this day isn't something that is widespread. It's certainly more prevalent than it was in the times of the Aruch HaShulchan, but it's not, I wouldn't call it widespread, which will lead it to become more mandatory. But it does seem to highlight a certain openness to use the evidence, the science, the history, the archaeological evidence, especially if it's low-hanging fruit and doesn't necessarily disrupt the tradition or lead to possible deviation of things. Right. Again, it opens up a discussion about history and archaeology, but since it seems to be the safest place to do so, and that is one that even since the times of the Aruch HaShulchan has picked up more conversation. Yes, Al.
Yeah, Rosie. I wanted to say that this is a wild example, but we know that the Beit HaMikdash or shuls are made of wood. There's no metal. You're not allowed to. Weaponry was not allowed in there. This goes on for all of the millennium. And now today we know for a fact that people who come into shuls, they have an ekdach or a gun. I'm not only talking about Israel, because of where they're located, but it's going in there, and it was considered against the law. But here it's for protection because of all the things that are happening.
So look, a lot of things change over time. I think that example, the shul temple parallelism isn't absolute, and so I don't know. With regards, there are no laws about the shul with regards to metal or weaponry and the like. The classic example, is that the shul doesn't need the same level of awe and reverence, right? That's why you had spittoons in the shul, because people were spitting in shul. You can't do that in the temple. So, but the overall, the overarching concept is the same. We may have a desire to proceed on parallel tracks with everything, but it doesn't always work out as neatly as that. And I think that you'll have those who try and narrow the focus because they recognize that you can get into difficulty by trying to make changes based upon the way things used to be by applying it to this contemporary reality. And you have those who are willing to entertain, but not necessarily. At some point, it seems that it would be very hard for an archaeological find to really change the law. It may give us some indication, it may give us a little bit of preference, it may provide a little bit more proof one way or another. And then you'll have those who say, let's avoid it, and it's a waste of time altogether. And some would see this as an expansion of our ability to understand and maybe make it more enriching. I guess you could say the two ends of the spectrum are Chazon Ish, Rav Kanievsky on the one hand, and Wolpe on the other, which isn't surprising, but it's definitely something that definitely something that rises to the level of a halachic discussion based on contemporary times.